Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story, Beijing is courting New Delhi and deepening ties with Russia and North Korea, a direct challenge to the United States. At the same time, President Trump is calling out the axis of evil. What's Washington's real strategy on India and the Chinese Communist Party? A senior China expert weighs in. With U.S. India trade tensions rising and geopolitical lines being redrawn, does Washington risk pushing New Delhi into Beijing's orbit? Brandon Weichert joins us to unpack what's at stake.
We are witnessing the rise of a new Eurasian order. Now, it is conditional, and it is not necessarily predicated on shared values per se.
The European Union is responding to President Trump's push for the EU to stop purchasing Russian oil. Here's the EU Energy Commissioner responding on Friday.
Not only has Putin weaponized energy against us, blackmailed member states, we are actually also indirectly helping finance Putin's war, and that needs to stop.
A State Department employee was sentenced to 4 years for trying to pass national defense secrets to someone he thought was working for Beijing. We have highlights from the case. Indian Prime Minister Modi and his first visit to China in 7 years is making waves, and not just because of the viral images of him laughing alongside Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Now President Donald Trump is weighing in, taking aim at China and what's being called the axis of evil. What is Trump's strategy on India, and why doesn't his art of the deal strategy seem to apply when it comes to the Chinese Communist regime? Let's dive in.
At the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit this week, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was seen chatting warmly with Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Then, Xi welcomed North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to Beijing's military parade, together with Putin. On Friday, President Trump weighed in with a comment saying, quote, "Looks like we've lost India and Russia to deepest, darkest China." When U.S. India trade talks stalled, Trump dismissed India as a dead economy. And starting August 27th, the U.S. imposed a 50% tariff on Indian imports. That includes a 25% tariff on India's continued purchase of Russian oil, which the U.S. argues helps fund Russia's war in Ukraine. India pushed back, calling the move unfair and pointing out that China is actually the largest buyer of Russian oil. Meanwhile, the Trump administration broke a years-long diplomatic silence with Pakistan and signed a new oil development deal with Islamabad. The move frustrated India as well. Some analysts say Trump's strategy is driving India closer to China, but senior analyst of China affairs, Alan Zhang, sees it differently. He believes this is a broader strategy to restore the American manufacturing industry and economic dominance.
U.S. sanctions on India have sparked frustration in New Delhi. It calls the measures unfair. Why, they ask, does Washington come down so hard on India while sparing Beijing? Well, there may be a deeper reason for Trump's actions. The sanctions are not only a punishment for India's purchases of Russian oil and arms. Trump may also want to prevent American businesses exiting China from relocating to India. In particular, he likely wants to discourage companies like Apple from shifting large-scale manufacturing to India. Instead, he wants to pressure them to return to the United States. Of course, he can't say this out loud. Trump has his overall strategy, and a big part of that is bringing critical supply chains back to America. So from this perspective, Trump's pressure on India can be seen as part of a broader geopolitical maneuver. The India sanctions may be more than just a reaction to its trade with Russia. They are part of Trump's long-term plan to revive America's industrial economy. He needs to take action on India to make that happen. The sanctions are just a pretext for executing his broader strategic plan.
U.S.-India relations are also based on the relationship between the country's two leaders. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton says the once close personal bond between Trump and Modi is now broken. Trump publicly claimed credit for easing the military tensions that occurred between India and Pakistan in May. In response, Pakistan nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, but Modi rejected the idea that Trump played any mediating role, insisting that India resolve the conflict on its own. For now, India has held off on retaliation. Before his visit to China, Modi stopped by Japan, where he told local media that India and the US have been friends in the past and will continue to be friends in the future. This week in Beijing, the Chinese government held a massive military parade. Xi stood atop Tiananmen Gate, flanked by Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. It was a show of unity from America's key adversaries. In response, President Trump posted on social media that same day, saying, quote, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America." It was one of Trump's few direct shots at China and its so-called axis of evil allies. It's a notable shift given that he has often referred to Xi Jinping as a good friend.
Trump seems to have gained a better understanding of the CCP over time, particularly during trade negotiations involving Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and by watching China's recent military parade in Beijing. These experiences help Trump understand that the CCP is not only a bad actor, but a formidable and uncompromising adversary. But Trump has also realized a harsh reality. The U.S. isn't able to decouple from China overnight. The two countries are deeply entangled economically, whether that's capital, supply chains, or investment. So a sudden breakaway isn't feasible. A strategic withdrawal of American capital and manufacturing from China needs time.
Currently, the U.S.-China tariff truce has been extended through November, but tensions remain high, with ongoing back and forth over fentanyl, rare earths, soybeans, and cotton. Trump's art of the deal approach has yielded results in trade talks with the EU, the UK, and Japan. So why hasn't it worked on China?
It seems President Trump doesn't fully understand Xi Jinping. Trump has always used business negotiation tactics in diplomacy and geopolitics. He will often apply pressure, then relent a little, hoping the other party will give in and compromise. But this won't work with Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. The CCP is fundamentally different from a typical business entity or even a nation-state that's rationally pursuing economic gain. For the CCP, the party's survival is more important than anything else, even the county's economic well-being. When Trump turns the screw expecting compromise, the CCP does not bend. The regime knows it can just pass on any pain and suffering to the Chinese people. As the old Chinese saying goes, "I'm not the one eating grass, my people are." This is a core feature of authoritarian regimes like China's. It's not thinking about the country's national interest. It's thinking about its own power and survival. That's something the CCP will never compromise on.
According to U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent, the next round of high-level trade talks could happen as early as late October or early November, but whether a real breakthrough is possible remains to be seen.
Could the Chinese Communist Party use trade tensions between the U.S. and India to its advantage? Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited China this week for the first time in 7 years. He met Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin there. Geopolitical analyst Brandon Weichert says the U.S. needs to be careful not to allow disagreements over trade policy push India closer to the CCP. Brandon Weichert, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's always good to be here.
Now, all eyes are on China right now with the military parade, but right before that, there was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization where India's Prime Minister Modi showed up for the first time in 7 years. Now, as part of that, there's been a lot of talks about trade. You did see Xi Jinping and Modi talking about their partnership is more of friends, not rivals. But in terms of trade, right, there are a lot of people pointing to numbers here because India has a $99.2 billion trade deficit with China, whereas if you want to talk about the U.S. has a $45 billion trade deficit with India. So some are wondering if, the U.S. tariffs on India for buying Russian oil are perhaps pushing them together. But how are you reading all of this? Is trade an aspect here, or, is it more about geopolitics?
Well, they're both actually feeding off of each other. Remember, the Trump administration entered office with a very good relationship with India, notably Prime Minister Modi. And in the last couple of months, it's sort of broken down quite significantly. So those geopolitical concerns are now feeding the trade concerns. In my opinion, the trade issue, the only reason Modi is nestling up to China is because he feels the Americans are pushing him toward China. And I would remind your audience, this is exactly what we did with Russia over Ukraine, where now Russia is part with China. And this new world order is being built that is meant to rival our own world order. We need to change our trade relations with India, but we can't do it at the expense of the geopolitics.
Now, on that note, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been playing down the notion that Trump's tariffs are pushing India closer to China. He's saying the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is performative, that it, happens all the time. How are you reading that? Is there, some truth to it?
The point here to remember is every year SCO meets, the main members are getting richer and more militarily capable every year. And you're seeing that really play out now this last meeting of the SCO. It is truly a competitor to the United States, still very much in its infancy or adolescence phase, but the longer that America continues to put up roadblocks, for instance, to India, or continues to push around or trying to push around Russia, or continues to deal with Turkey the way it has, the more incentive these countries have to form a classic war party and to challenge the United States in a much more protracted way than they've ever done since the Cold War.
Now, we did see, India's Prime Minister Modi there for the first time in 7 years. But at the same time, you have that long-standing border dispute between India and China. So how likely are we to see those warming relations between India and China?
Well, that remains to be seen. I think that's really contingent, actually, on really what the Trump administration wants to do long term. If the Trump administration wants to continue pushing India around and humiliating them publicly, that's the key thing here. So really, whether the Indians can resolve their problems with China over their northern border remains to be seen, and it is largely contingent on whether India thinks it can get a good deal from America or if it has to get a better deal from China. And that remains to be seen. We don't really know what Trump's planning to do long term with the tariffs on India.
We did see that picture with Xi, Modi, and Putin looking quite chummy together. What message potentially was that sending to the U.S.?
You need to get on board with some level of negotiation and stop trying to dictate to us. This is the biggest thing that's come out of these meetings in China has been the ideology. I'm calling it the resistance ideology. It's not even necessarily communism anymore. China and Russia and now India are creating this narrative that they are resisting unfair imperial practices of the West. And Trump is inadvertently reinforcing that narrative, I think, by being so dictatorial toward India. We do need to reset trade relations with India, particularly on the H-1B visa, but we can do it in a way that is not so imperious and doesn't drive them into the arms of China and or Russia. We are witnessing the rise of a new Eurasian order. Now, it is conditional, and it is not necessarily predicated on shared values per se. I do believe if we get on the right strategy, diplomatically and economically, we can peel countries like India, countries like Turkey, maybe even Russia itself, away from this Chinese-led alliance. But the harder we push against these countries on ancillary issues, the less inclined these countries will be to operate fairly with us, and the more likely they will be ensnared in China's growing spider web, geopolitical and economic spider web in Eurasia. And sooner or later, those countries will not be able to break away.
A lot to watch for sure. Brandon Weichert, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The European Union is backing President Trump's plan to stop buying Russian oil. On Thursday, Trump said Europe's oil purchases are financing Russia's war in Ukraine. The EU's energy commissioner responded the next day, saying he agrees with the president and hopes for Trump's support moving forward.
Not only has Putin weaponized energy against us, blackmailed member states, we are actually also indirectly helping finance Putin's war, and that needs to stop. And if President Trump agrees to that, then that is only a welcome support, because that is certainly our main objective.
Trump told Western allies yesterday that Europe pays Russia over $1 billion annually in oil purchases, thus funding the war in Ukraine. The president also emphasized that European leaders should place economic pressure on China for funding Russia's war effort. The European Union is negotiating legal proposals to phase out imports of Russian oil and gas by 2028. The energy commissioner says he hasn't come under pressure from the U.S. to halt Russian oil purchases before the 2028 deadline. And he added that he'd welcome U.S. backing for the bloc's plan.
Other major buyers of Russian oil include China and India. In a recent espionage case, a State Department employee was sentenced to 4 years in prison Thursday. He was convicted of conspiring to pass national defense information to people he believed were working for Beijing.
The Justice Department says Mike Shenna worked at State Department headquarters in Washington. He held a top secret security clearance and had access to information up to the secret level. The DOJ says Shenna communicated with people he met online through various platforms beginning in April 2022. It says he provided them sensitive U.S. government information in exchange for money. In August 2024, Shenna allegedly met an individual at a hotel in Peru who provided him with $10,000 and a cell phone. Prosecutors say the phone was intended to be used for Shenna to receive tasks and transmit information. They say Shenna used the cell phone to photograph and transmit at least 4 classified documents that contained national defense information.
The Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies says there have been 224 cases of Chinese espionage against the U.S. since 2000. Coming up, a U.S. lawmaker is calling on the Senate to pass the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. This comes after reports of Putin and Xi discussing organ transplants on a hot mic in Beijing. The State Department is cracking down on China's influence in Central America. New visa restrictions are targeting Central American nationals accused of working for the Chinese Communist Party. Mexico says it's considering tariffs on countries without trade deals, and that includes China. We'll take a look at what this could mean for trade. That and more in just a minute here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A U.S. lawmaker is calling on the Senate to pass the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. This push comes after Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping were reportedly caught discussing organ transplants earlier this week. Beijing has tried to cover up the issue, while human rights groups continue to expose China's practice of forcibly harvesting organs from prisoners of conscience. NTD's Melina Weisskopf reports.
Congressman Chris Smith said bluntly, "Cruelty knows no bounds," referring to a hot mic moment earlier this week between China's Xi and Russia's Putin. The two leaders were caught discussing becoming younger with continued organ transplants. Xi suggested the possibility of living to 150 years old in this century. Following the incident, Western media reports highlighted the moment in shock, while Beijing sought to cover it up. Chinese media outlets have taken down videos containing the clip or covered the sound with music and replays. Russian leader Putin confirmed the talk while adding he didn't pay attention to it. The topic hits a nerve for Chinese Communist Party leaders. Human rights activists are working to expose the CCP's forced live organ harvesting.
When you do something like this, you think you're getting a great benefit, but you are doing it at a terrible cost to someone else's life.
An independent investigation from the UK's China Tribunal in 2019 found the killing for organs scheme to be widespread in China. The report concluded that Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. Falun Gong or Falun Dafa is a group facing persecution in China for over 2 decades. Congressman Smith told the Epoch Times on Thursday, "My own argument has been that from Xi Jinping on down, anybody in the higher echelon, especially in the Chinese Communist Party, will look to steal somebody else's internal organs through coercion, through death, to extend their life. I can't think of a more selfish and barbaric act to do that."
Being committed right now as we meet by Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. They are murdering tens of thousands of young people, Uyghurs, Falun Gong practitioners, and some others, in order to steal their organs.
Congressman Smith has long fought the persecution in the halls of Congress. He's now urging the Senate to quickly pass his Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. It passed the House in May. House Speaker Mike Johnson suggested it go at the top of the priority list. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
Shifting gears to Central America, the State Department is warning about China's influence in that region. It's rolling out new visa restrictions on Central American nationals accused of working on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the policy targets those who knowingly support or direct CCP-backed efforts that undermine Central America's rule of law. Rubio said those individuals, along with their immediate family members, will be barred from entering the U.S. The State Department says some nationals are already facing restrictions under the new policy. The Chinese embassy in Washington has not commented on the new restrictions. In recent years, Beijing has worked to expand its influence in Latin America by increasing its presence in politics, economics, and military cooperation. This region has historically been under the U.S. sphere of influence, and it's often considered America's backyard. The Nasdaq stock exchange is tightening rules for smaller Chinese-listed stocks. The exchange is trying to crack down on schemes where stock prices are artificially pumped higher before insiders quickly sell them off. This means big profits for the sellers, but big losses for the buyers left holding the bag. The Nasdaq has been struggling to prevent these pump and dump schemes for years. The FBI says the problem is only getting worse. Cases have climbed nearly 300% this year. According to the Financial Times, U.S. investors have lost billions on Chinese stocks, which were heavily promoted on social media. Back in July, 7 Chinese companies saw their shares plunge more than 80% in just a few days, wiping $3.7 billion off their market value. Under Nasdaq's new rules, companies will need to make at least $15 million worth of stock available for the public to buy and sell. That means more shares will be held by non-company insiders. The exchange is also reinforcing a requirement that was set back in 2020. Companies from restrictive markets, like China, must have a minimum public offering size of $25 million. Since August 2022, nearly 70% of the cases Nasdaq has flagged to U.S. regulators have involved Chinese firms. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said on Thursday that her government is considering tariffs on countries without trade deals with Mexico, and that includes China.
Yes, we're considering as part of the Plan Mexico that we put forward when we started our government, imposing tariffs on countries with which we don't have a trade deal, including China, but not only.
The tariffs would cover a broad range of products, including cars, textiles, and plastics. Trump has accused Mexico of serving as a stopover for Chinese goods, meaning Chinese companies send goods to Mexico and change the label from Made in China to Made in Mexico to avoid high U.S. tariffs. Since taking office at the start of the year, Trump has been pushing Mexico to hike tariffs on Chinese imports. Mexico is part of the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For on-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you soon.